So the House Administration Committee will come to order. First, apologies to our witnesses, our commissioners, for your patience. We had to reschedule because of a classified briefing, and then we had votes, which made us a half an hour even later than we thought. So we are sorry, but that's the nature of things these days. This is, however, a very important hearing on the Election Assistance Commission. It's been over 8 years since this committee held an oversight hearing on the EAC, and over these 8 years, responsibilities and, more significantly, the challenges in election administration have evolved. The greatest change has been the introduction of a known election threat to our nation. In advance of the presidential elections in 2016, Russia conducted cyber operations to interfere in federal elections and to undermine public confidence in our American democracy. In response, last year, Congress appropriated $380 million for the EAC to distribute to states to support equipment purchases and security enhancements. The EAC has done a commendable job of distributing those sorely needed funds to states quickly and efficiently, and I was heartened to learn that states could begin collecting their grant money less than 30 days from the time the fiscal year 2018 Consolidated Appropriations Act was signed into law. But let's be clear, that appropriation should be just a start. This committee must act on legislation to secure our elections. For the first time in 10 years, the EAC has its full complement of 4 commissioners. With a quorum now in place, since the addition of 2 new commissioners, the commission is poised for a fresh start. Because there is much work to do, we intend to keep you very busy. The committee finds itself in a similar posture with changes in leadership and membership. And I'm glad to sit next to our ranking member, Rodney Davis of Illinois, because Mr. Davis represents some of the good intentions of my colleagues across the aisle. We're no longer considering the termination of this agency, and we both agree that threats to our election systems are important and deserve our attention. In the wake of irrefutable evidence of foreign interference in our elections, I'm hopeful we can make progress on election security soon. There have been bipartisan statements in support of new election security measures, and I'm hopeful we can turn those statements into action because this committee should act. I'm confident that we can produce a bipartisan election security initiative that will help our colleagues in the Senate see a way forward. In last week's EAC oversight hearing in Senate Rules, Chairman Roy Blunt, our former colleague here in the House, explained that the Senate did not move forward on election security last year or this year because, I quote, "I think the majority leader is of the view that this debate reaches no conclusion," unquote. The leaders of this committee and the leaders of our national intelligence community have seen a clear conclusion. We must secure our elections, and the buck must stop with us. As Senator Durbin pointed out last week about previous election interference, it was, and I quote, "sweeping and systematic," and Illinois has evidence of it. They're coming at us again, and they might not be alone in their efforts, and shame on us if, as elected members of the Senate, we can't even bring the matter to the floor for a vote or a debate. We have an obligation more than anything to make sure that the integrity of our elections in a democracy is protected, and that's the end of the quote. This committee can pick up where our colleagues in the Senate Rules left off, starting with the agency before us today, the agency focused on helping America vote. The EAC is under-resourced. The EAC operates with half the staff and half the budget it had a decade ago. While resources have decreased, demands on the agency have increased. EAC funding has moved from a high of $25.1 million in fiscal year 2009 to a low of $9.2 million in fiscal year 2019. Similar challenges exist with respect to staff resources. Where the EAC had a staff of 49 in 2010, the 2019 staff members only 22, or less than half the size of the 2010 staff. We understand that you cannot be asked to do so much with so little resources. However, our support for this agency means we must also be fair and firm. Accordingly, this oversight hearing. the first in 8 years, and will raise some profound challenges about the agency, and we expect forthright and honest answers. For this committee to support the agency's request of significantly increased resources, the witnesses before us must demonstrate that they acknowledge problems with the commission that have been raised both publicly and privately. This committee can only champion increased support for this agency if the agency holds up its end of the bargain, and that will mean addressing severe personnel and management challenges and righting the ship of what has appeared to be an occasionally hyper-partisan and dysfunctional enterprise. Commissioners must assure this committee that increased support will mean proper management, visionary leadership, and effective and reliable technical expertise at the agency. Together, we aim to protect America's most precious asset, her democracy. We believe in the good faith efforts and intentions of all of you here as committee members and witnesses, and will do our best to support you because of the gravity of your charge. But this means that we will also demand the best of you, just as the American people demand the best of this nation. Our hope is that this oversight can provide a roadmap for necessary improvements and the tremendous gains that could be made by infusing the agency with new resources and new personnel. Ultimately, it is our shared goal to discuss how to fully equip this agency and to make sure you're prepared and battle ready for 2020. I look forward to your comments, but before that, I would recognize our ranking member, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, for any comments he would like to make.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. I appreciate your willingness to hold these bipartisan hearings, reviewing our current election practices with the aim of helping our states to secure their elections. Election security is one of the most important issues that this committee is tasked with, and I take the committee's role of ensuring fair and secure elections very seriously, as I know you do too. As we discussed in our hearing last week, we know that at least 21 states were targeted by a foreign state actor prior to the 2016 U.S. election, and we know that Russia undertook a misinformation campaign during the same election. But issues surrounding our election infrastructure are not limited to Russia, nor do they begin in 2016 or end in 2018. I believe we must approach election security on 3 fronts. First, we need to examine what we can learn and improve upon from the past. Second, we must examine what new and evolving challenges states are facing. Third, we need to examine what role the federal government can and should play in elections. The Election Assistance Commission is critical to all of these fronts, and I believe our commissioners will be able to provide a tremendous amount of insight this afternoon. This committee was instrumental in the passage of the Help America Vote Act in 2002, from which most of our nation's current election infrastructure can be traced. HAVA created the EAC and the grant structure through which over $3 billion passed between 2002 and 2010, and another $380 million continues following last year's appropriation. HAVA also tasked the EAC with the responsibility of adopting voluntary voting system guidelines, developing guidance to meet HAVA requirements, and serving as a central source of information on election administration. These services and others still being provided through the EAC warrant review, and if we can improve or add to them, we should. We must use this opportunity to ensure the Commission has the resources needed to complete not only its original mission from 2002, but also its new responsibilities undertaken since the 2016 election. Today, I want an honest assessment of what we've gotten right and what we've gotten wrong over the last 17 years. Also, where do we need to make improvements, and what do you all need from us to help us better serve our states? In examining what new and evolving challenges states are facing, cybersecurity is clearly at the forefront. This is not the only challenge, however, that our states face. The average age of most voting equipment in the United States will soon be measured in decades. The cost to recruit and train poll workers remains high, and voter registration system maintenance remains critical but costly. As my good friend Senator Blunt pointed out to my home state senator last week during the Senate Rules EAC hearing, voter fraud does exist, and we must ensure our states are prepared against it. In examining how states have used and will continue to use their 2018 HAVA funds, I hope to learn more from our commissioners on the needs of our state and local officials. It's also important to hear directly from states on how they are using federal resources to overcome unique challenges to their states and localities. Recently, my home state of Illinois was able to invest in a new Cyber Navigator program that helps counties detect and defend themselves against cybersecurity attacks. I was able to hear more about this program just last week during a bipartisan election security roundtable that I held in my district. Local county officials graciously gave their time to discuss the inner workings of their election system and express their ideas to better secure their systems. I found the discussion helpful and productive, and I hope to hold more of these roundtables in the future as states continue to enhance their security and their efforts to ensure every American's vote is both counted and protected. Lastly, I believe assisting states with the tools they need to protect their election systems is the proper role for the federal government. This must be balanced against the constitutional duty for states to run and provide for their own elections. I'm not for the federal government mandating or taking over state and local elections. The EAC plays an immeasurable role in being the interface between the federal government and our states. I not only want to hear from our witnesses today on how that interface is going, I also want to hear where we need to draw certain lines to ensure our federalism remains. As we move forward in our next steps to address election security, we can make a bunch of partisan noise. We can do that here today and blame one another for who should have done more to protect our elections, or we can make progress. I choose the latter and encourage my colleagues to join me in this approach. We have a real opportunity to address a growing problem that is causing Americans to lose confidence in their election systems, but we must work together to make sure the progress in keeping our nation's election system secure and free from interference is our #1 priority. Thank you again to Madam Chairperson. Thank you to our witnesses for being here to speak on behalf of the EAC, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back by unanimous consent. All members of the committee may have the opportunity to submit opening statements for the record. And at this point, I would like to introduce our witnesses who are members of the commission. Chairwoman Christy McCormick has served on the EAC since 2014. She previously served as the chairwoman for the 2015 term. Prior to her appointment to the EAC, she served as a senior trial attorney in the voting rights section of the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice, a position she held until joining the commission. She was detailed by the Deputy Attorney General to be the Senior Attorney Advisor and Acting Deputy Rule of Law Coordinator in the Office of the Rule of Law Coordinator at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, Iraq from 2009 to 2010, where she worked as the U.S. elections expert overseeing the Iraqi national elections. Prior to joining the Department of Justice, Chairwoman McCormick served as judicial clerk to the Honorable Elizabeth A. McClanahan in the Court of Appeals from 2003 to 2006. She was also an assistant attorney general and assistant to the Solicitor General of the Office of Attorney General for Virginia from 2001 to 2003. We welcome you, Chairwoman. We also have the Vice Chair of the Commission, Mr. Benjamin Hovland, who was confirmed to serve on the EAC in January of this year. He serves as a designated federal officer for the Technical Guidelines Development Committee, and most recently, Vice Chair Hovland was the acting chief counsel for the U.S. Senate Committee on Rules and Administration, where he focused on election administration and campaign finance regulations. Earlier in his career, he was Deputy General Counsel for the Missouri Secretary of State, where he focused on legal issues related to the administration of state and federal elections, including recounts, poll worker training, voter registration list maintenance, statewide database matching, voter education resources, and ballot initiative litigation. As an attorney for the Fair Elections Legal Network, Vice Chair Hovland focused on protecting Americans' access to the ballot box, including litigation to stop efforts to purge voters from the rolls based on inaccurate data matching in the lead-up to the election. Commissioner Thomas Hicks has served on the EAC since 2014 and has twice served as the Commission's chairman. He also serves as a designated federal officer for the EAC Board of Advisors. Prior to his appointment to the EAC, Commissioner Hicks served as Senior Elections Counsel and Minority Elections Counsel on this committee, the U.S. the Committee on House Administration, a position he held from 2003 to 2014. He covered issues here relating to campaign finance, election reform, contested elections, and agency oversight. And before joining the committee staff, he was a senior lobbyist and policy analyst for Common Cause, and earlier in his career, he was a special assistant and legislative assistant in the Office of Congressional Relations for the Office of Personnel Management. And last but certainly not least is Commissioner Donald Palmer, who was confirmed to serve on the EAC in January of this year. He is a former Bipartisan Policy Center Fellow, where he provided testimony to state legislatures on election administration and voting reforms concerning election modernization. Commissioner Palmer was appointed Secretary of the Virginia Board of Elections by former Virginia Governor Bob McConnell in 2011 and served as the Commonwealth's Chief Election Officer until 2014. He formerly served as the Florida Department of State's Director of Elections from 2008 and the 2010 election cycles, and prior to his work in election administration, he served as a trial attorney with the Voting Rights Section of the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. He was a U.S. Navy intelligence officer and judge advocate general, and he was awarded the Navy Meritorious Service Medal, the Navy Commendation Medal, and the Joint Service Commendation Medal. Welcome to all of you. Your entire statements will be put in the record, and we ask that you summarize in about 5 minutes what you wish to tell us. When you get to 1 minute left, the yellow light on the table will go on. We'd ask that you try and wrap up at that point. I ask also that unanimous consent that all members will have 5 days to revise and extend their remarks and have written statements made part of the record. So with that, we will go to our witnesses, and let's start with you, Chairwoman McCormick. Welcome. There's a little, there we go. Oh, you're just one statement. Okay, well, that's fine, and then we will go to questions for all the members. What about another microphone? Mr. Palmer will give you his. Is the button on? Mr. Jones, can you help?
Who's in charge of technology around here?
Well, I think do any of them work? No. If we speak without the microphones, will it be picked up on the? Are we rebooting? Well, they're trying to reboot the system. While they're doing that, I will do some housekeeping matters. We will adhere to the 5-minute rule after we hear from the chairperson of the commission. But since you are speaking for everyone, we will have a very gentle gavel, if that helps. Does it work now? Yeah, why don't we have you come sit up here? And we'll continue to try and reboot so when we have questions, everybody can be heard.
This is the short way to become a member of the House of Representatives.
So, welcome, Chairwoman.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Lofgren, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you this afternoon to detail the vital work of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, better known as the EAC. We are pleased that a quorum of commissioners has been reestablished at the EAC, and we are delighted to discuss the Commission's work to fulfill its mission as prescribed by our enabling legislation, the Help America Vote Act of 2002. While we each took diverse paths in coming to the EAC, we are in lockstep when it comes to this message. The Commission is as needed today as it has been at any other time since it was established, but we are at a critical crossroads with regard to having sufficient resources necessary to better support state and local election administrators and the voters they serve. The EAC is the only federal agency solely devoted to supporting those officials in this work and helping America vote. We are committed to maximizing our impact ahead of the next federal election and providing services that not only meet but exceed the expectations of those who are counting on us to do our job. We take seriously the fact that voter confidence is enhanced when we adequately prepare for and respond to challenges such as election misinformation campaigns, persistent attempts to breach election systems and voter registration databases, and other real threats. As the agency best positioned to communicate directly with election officials across the country, the EAC played an early and leading role in establishing trust and open lines of communications between state and local leaders and the federal government entities that work on election security. The EAC drove the development of the Election Security Working Group that eventually became the Subsector's Government Coordinating Council, or GCC, and played an integral role in establishing the Sector Coordinating Council, SCC, comprised of private election equipment manufacturers and vendors. Beyond the GCC and SCC, the Commission has taken a multifaceted approach to helping state and local election officials strengthen their election security. This work includes testing and federally certifying voting systems, providing hands-on security and post-election audit trainings across the country, producing security-focused resources, disseminating security best practices information and checklists to state and local election officials, as well as hosting widely attended forums that feature security experts as speakers. There is no shortage of ambition at the EAC when it comes to supporting this work, but there is a stark shortage of funds for such activities. Last year, members of Congress provided $380 million in much-needed and much-appreciated financial support to the states and territories through the EAC. We know from state plans and expenditure reports that most states are spending these funds on items that will directly improve election security. In fact, at least 90% of the funds have been devoted to cybersecurity improvements, the purchase of new voting equipment, and improvements to voter registration systems. Through our most recent conversations with all 55 states and territories that received these funds, we believe that as of April 30th, 2019, states have spent at least $108.14 million, or 29% of the $380 million in grant funds. States are on a glide path to spending 85% of the funds on a straight-line projection by 2020. As states seek to invest these funds in purchasing new voting equipment, election leaders are continuing to turn to the EAC's testing and certification program as a key resource in ensuring the nation's voting systems are tested to confirm the secure and accurate tabulation of ballots. This includes information on when the EAC will implement the next iteration of the Voluntary Voting Systems Guidelines, which will be known as VVSG 2.0. The VVSG have historically consisted of principles, guidelines, and requirements against which voting systems can be tested to determine if the systems meet required standards. These guidelines are voluntary, and states may decide to adopt them entirely or in part. Last year, the TGDC, as well as the EAC's Board of Advisors and Standards Board, recommended adoption of the proposed VVSG 2.0 guidelines and principles. Unfortunately, when one of the commissioners left the EAC, we lost our quorum and were not able to vote to move the new guidelines forward. That changed earlier this year when the Senate confirmed our two new EAC commissioners. In February, after Commissioner Palmer and Commissioner Hovland were confirmed, our first official act was to unanimously vote to publish the VVSG 2.0 principles and guidelines in the Federal Register for a 90-day public comment period. Our first public hearing took place on April 10th in Memphis, and we held our second public meeting in Salt Lake City on April 23rd. Yesterday, we held our third hearing at our office in Silver Spring. The public comment period on the VVSG 2.0 principles and guidelines concludes later this month on May 29th. While election security is a topic that is a priority for all of us, election officials have support needs beyond security. To demonstrate this, the EAC has developed a wheel of competencies in which each section represents a similar level of expertise and effort. This wheel represents the fundamental roadmap of issues the EAC should address fully to meet the vision of HAVA. Today, the EAC lacks sufficient funding for the human capital capacity to address all of these areas in depth. In fact, the last time the EAC had a full slate of commissioners, the commission had 49 employees. Today, it has only 22, and our budget is 50% less than it was in FY 2010. Without additional resources, we simply will not be able to provide the breadth of support election officials need and expect from the EAC to ensure secure, accessible, and efficient elections. With the reestablishment of a quorum of commissioners, the EAC is ready for its next chapter. My fellow commissioners and I look forward to working with Congress as we continue our efforts to help America vote. I am happy to answer any questions you have following today's testimony. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think they're trying to set up an alternate mic system.
It's working.
Is it working? Hallelujah.
Should be working, yes.
Ah, very good. So now we can go to our members for questions, 5 minutes apiece, and we'll turn first to our ranking member, Mr. Davis, for his questions.
Well, here we go with the microphones. Commissioner McCormick, I'll start with you. Thank you. I certainly wish many of our folks that testify together combine their opening statements like that. That was great for time, and then I really look forward to hearing the testimony from each and every one of you with questions. So, Ms. McCormick, you mentioned at the Senate hearing last week that parts of the EAC's core mission have suffered with the additional roles that the Commission has taken on since 2016. Can you first describe the transformation that the EAC has undergone since late 2016? And second, describe how your core mission has suffered?
Thank you for the question, Representative Davis. The EAC has undergone somewhat of a transition since a quorum was reestablished in 2015. One of the commissioner's top priorities was to right the posture of the agency and to work on emphasizing our assistance mission to the state and local election officials. Post-2016, the EAC has taken on an additional very important mission, and that is to support election administrators to prepare for the escalating threat dynamic that we now face in this country. Election security has always been a top priority for election officials, and when HAVA was passed, the current environment was not envisioned, and the EAC did not have this kind of a mission with regard to security as we do now. We have stepped up and tried to fill that mission, although we've had to stretch our employees to their breaking point in order to meet the requirements that we feel are needed to support the state and local election officials to help mitigate the risks and prepare to keep the secure infrastructure with elections.
Well, Chair McCormick, thank you. I agree with your assessment that some things have changed, and by all accounts, the Commission's doing what it can to provide significant value to our states, not only the 2018 midterm elections. I fully expect the Commission to work effectively again in a bipartisan manner, both internally and with the states for the 2020 presidential election. Well, I got some time left. Okay. Chair McCormick or Commissioner Palmer, is any method of voting 100% secure?
The short answer is no, but there are a variety of steps that both states and the EAC can do through its certification program to mitigate those challenges.
Okay, can you describe the common voting machines in use across the country today?
Yes, sir. The majority is about four different types of systems are used. Basically, the paper optical scan voting system is the majority, that's used in the majority of precincts across the country. You also have the ballot marking devices with paper, You also have DREs with VPAPs or a paper trail, and then you have DREs in a minority of states that were used in 2018 that have no paper trail with those DREs.
All right, we've heard a lot about paper ballots recently. Are paper ballots necessarily more safe and secure than a DRE machine with a voter-verified paper audit trail?
Not necessarily, the paper does provide some alternative mechanism if there's disputes. So if you need to do an audit, a recount, you have that paper that you could then look at if there were some allegations of interference or intrusion.
Well, yeah, you're right. They do have their own challenges. I can remember I think it was the 2012 Illinois primary, had a problem with ballots in one county going through the optical scanner. The ballots were printed too large. So they had to take a paper cutter and cut them down to be able to get them to go through. So they do present some challenges. What other challenges do you think could be associated with paper ballots?
Well, paper ballots, particularly for, there's the management of all the paper ballots that occurs. And for many jurisdictions that have used DREs, there's a process by which they have to become more acquainted with the paper and sort of making sure there's ballot management so you don't misplace or lose ballots, and you make sure you have them all in a secure manner. Also, directly voting hand to a ballot sometimes has issues, or it often does, with individuals with disabilities because they don't have that capability. So there may have to be some sort of technology like a ballot marking device or certain DRE technology that allows a voter with a disability to vote independently, privately, which is one of the charges under the Help America Vote Act.
Right. I see my time has run out. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I would then turn to the gentleman from Maryland for his questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Welcome to all of you. As the congressman from the EAC in Silver Spring, Maryland, I'm delighted to see all of you here, and I've very much enjoyed my visits there. And Mr. Hicks, thank you for showing me around when you were the chairman. I appreciate that. So let's see. To Chair McCormick, let me ask you, the term of the current executive director, Brian Newby, expires in November. And obviously it's crucial that we get the next ED in place quickly to guarantee a smooth transition and a fully operational, functional EAC for the election. Given that the search for a new executive director could take a long time, presumably we'd want to start the process as soon as possible. You were asked about this in the Rules Committee hearing on the Senate side last week, whether you would commit to holding a vote to allow the Board of Advisors and Standards Board to begin searching, and you said you would consult with the legal team to figure it out. Have you spoken with the legal team, and what was the result of your conversation?
Well, there is a process set out in HAVA, and that is that we have to wait until there's a vacancy in order to start the process of an executive search through the two boards that we have, executive search committees that would be set up at that time, and that would mean that we would have to wait until there's a vacancy.
You mean you can't start the process of getting ready, like, I don't know, are you finding an outside firm to do the search, or you can't put out the word now?
Well,
why is it? I don't understand.
That's under HAVA, and I'm following our governing statute.
It says you can't do any preparatory
It says
work.
there's a vacancy.
Well, my
And
concern-
also, I think it's important for us to have some continuity leading up to the 2020 presidential election. It's important for us to have a leadership team in place, and if we wait until there's a vacancy, it will take us a while to do that, putting us right smack dab in the middle of an election year, assuming that we would
let me get you
change
straight. So in
leadership,
other
but I'm
words,
not comfortable with changing the leadership.
I'm sorry, so you're not going to wait for the vacancy to take place?
No, I am. I'm going to wait until the process. I'm going to follow the process that HAVA sets out for us.
My concern is if you wait until November when there's a vacancy and there are not 3 votes to retain Mr. Newby or 3 votes to begin a search process, the commission will have to move to its succession plan because, as I understand it, Mr. Newby is not permitted to stay around in a holdover status. So under the EAC's Organizational Management Policy Statement of 2015, the agency has established an order of succession in the event that there's nobody in the executive director position. the first person in the order of succession for the executive director is the general counsel, but his term expires in November as well. Is that right?
Yes.
So the next person in the order of succession is the chief operating officer, but that position is vacant now, right?
Yes.
So if there's no general counsel and no CO, the next person in the order of succession is the chief financial officer. Is that position filled?
That position is not filled. We do have a different person with a different title doing our finances right now.
Okay.
But you have to look at the policy says when there are no commissioners. So that succession policy would not be in effect in October because all the commissioners will be there presumptively.
I'm not sure that's the way I'm reading it, but I'll go back and check that out. But just to get it straight, so if there's no general counsel, there's no COO, there's no CFO, the next person in line to run the EAC would be the communications director. Is that right under the?
That's right under the communication, or under that policy, but in my opinion, that policy, I would have to check with our general counsel, but that policy would not be in effect because we still retain commissioners. So that succession policy goes into effect when there are no commissioners, no executive director, no general counsel.
So what happens if there are commissioners under your reading of it?
Well, then we would have to have either a vote to retain the current leadership, or we maybe possibly could put them in an acting status. I'm not sure. We'd have to talk to general counsel about that.
It just sounds like it's not fully staffed up. And again, my reading of it, admittedly cursory, was that you would go down this line of succession. You end up with the communications director as the possible acting executive director of the Election Assistance Commission going into the 2020 elections. Do you view the current statutory formula as preventing you from establishing a search committee now?
Yes, sir, I do.
Can you cite for me the part of it which you think
I don't have
prevents-
HABA in front of me, but it does say upon a vacancy or something of that nature.
Right, but
We don't have a vacancy right now, and I'm confident that the commissioners can work in a bipartisan manner to assure that we have continuity at this time with our leadership and moving into the presidential election in 2020.
But I mean, the term is up regardless, so there would be a vacancy even if it's momentary, right? So you do not view yourself as having to go through a search process or to be prepared for a search
I think
process?
there's a number of steps that come before that, and that's including deciding whether or not we want to continue the term of the current leadership. And if that is the case, that we don't continue the
Okay.
leadership, then we'll look to the process at that
All right, thank you.
point.
Mr. Hicks, would you weigh in on this if you would? I mean, is this the right way to proceed? I mean, for all I know, it is, but
think
it
that
seems odd to me. I've not seen
The
that.
chairwoman's correct in that it states that that we can't start anything until there's a vacancy. But I don't think that prohibits the Board of Advisors or the Standards Board from operating on their own accord to set up a committee to start the search. That would also, we have to check with the general counsel on that, but I don't think that precludes the start of a search by those two boards right now.
When
We don't have to tell them to do that, but they can do that on their own, as they're our advisory boards.
I see. When you say consult with the general counsel, who are you consulting with, given that there is no general?
We have a general counsel now,
I see.
so
Okay.
that's what.
I gotcha. Okay, I don't know whether any of the other commissioners wanted to weigh in on this question, or no? Am I out of time? I yield back, Madam Chair.
The
Thank you.
gentleman, but we have a gentle gavel today because we have said one opening statement, so the gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to follow up on what Mr. Raskin was asking, it sounds like, though, you're trying to follow the law in the way even if the law is not advantageous to actually filling the executive director's position. Is that true? Just trying to follow?
That's
the letter
correct,
of the law.
sir. We're trying to follow the HAVA process set out by Congress.
Okay, I appreciate that. We don't always see that in a lot of agencies, trying to follow the laws that we pass. So kind of a general question for everyone. Do you feel like that the voluntary voting standards is one of the most important functions of what you do?
Yes, sir.
Yes?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay. And this could go to anyone that would like to do it. Could you briefly just walk us through the development of the VVSG 2.0? How you get to actually get to the, I know you spoke about it briefly, but what's the process of getting to actually getting this?
So Representative Loudermilk, I'll try to answer that. So the process by which you would update or establish the VVSG, in this case would be 2.0, is HAVA sets out a process, once again, the Congress has enacted, where the EAC has advisory boards. You have the Technical Guidelines Development Committee, you have the advisory board, you have the Standards Board, which is made up of election officials. TGDC is made up of technical experts and some state officials, and the Board of Advisors of stakeholders in the process. And these three committees provide input and recommendations to the EAC on what those new standards would be.
Okay.
And we do this in conjunction with NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology. They work with us, they work with the boards, and these recommended standards are then provided to the executive director and then for his recommendation to this board, to us. We have hearings on those to make sure that we're trying to bring technology that for the last 5 to 10 years, bring those to the new standards so our voting systems are as secure and as accessible as possible, usability, all those functions. And so that's in the process that we're in right now with 2.0. We are now engaged with the high-level standards. We're looking at requirements, and we're going to have public hearings on these things, and eventually we'll vote, work with the vendors to provide test assertions to which they can bring their voting systems into our laboratories for testing, and then provide those to the marketplace, to the election officials, which voters will then vote on. So that is really one of our major duties, and we take it very seriously. It's very complicated and sometimes confusing, even for us, but we have a lot of wealth of experience on the commission. We have a team that's been in place for a long time, and we're hoping to bring those to fruition so we can have new voting systems for 2024.
When do you anticipate having 2.0 ready?
Well, my hope is sometime in early 2020 or late 2019 that we could have enough in place. That's my goal. I think we can meet it, that the manufacturers know what our new requirements are. So we have the high-level guidelines of what the system should be. We have the requirements of which those systems would be tested to. And then we could have that conversation with the laboratories and with our manufacturers to the vendors. So we can then bring those new voting systems in about 2 to 3 years. They'll have new voting systems in the marketplace. My hope, realistically, is that the election officials and jurisdictions will be able to buy new equipment in 22, 2023.
Okay.
So there's new voting systems for some jurisdictions.
So you're talking about 2 to 3 years of development once you get the standards
Yes,
out
sir.
there. And you're involved in the testing?
We are.
Once
We
it
are.
comes
The
out?
EAC is involved with the testing of those voting systems that the manufacturers bring in under those standards. And so we are involved in that process.
Do you anticipate the new voting machines, DREs with VVPAT available under 2.0?
Technically, it's probably possible. I don't know. I think one manufacturer has considered building a new DRE, but I don't. Right now, most of the vendors are now with ballot marking devices or optical scan, digital scan of paper. And so most of the new systems, if not all, will be paper-based voting
Really?
systems and come out at 2.0.
Really?
Well, there is a section of HAVA that does require certain DRE technology
Yeah.
under HAVA because of the focus on accessibility for voters with disabilities.
Right, and you mentioned that
Right.
in your questions, and that's one of my concerns is the technology of the DRE does facilitate for moving folks through a little faster in a lot of these, but it does require more machines. So anyhow, all right. I see my time's expired. I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from California, Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you all for being here. It sounds like it hasn't been easy lately, that it's been tough being part of the commission. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the $380 million of HAVA funds that I guess with the grant expenditure report, there were certainly a number of questions of whether that should have been spent more quickly, but I also noticed that the rest of that money should be spent on upgrades up to about 85%. So I was just wondering about that. How does that mesh with what you're hearing from the states and localities?
Thank you, Representative Davis. Yes, the $380 million from FY18 was very welcome by the state and local election administrators. I think what we saw in our initial report, that was based on FY18, and so it was only through September 30, and so you just saw a snapshot. But when you looked at that with the state plans that were provided, you could see that states were choosing from a menu of options. Recently, our grants team reached out to all the states and updated that number, so you can project a trajectory that about 85% of the money will be spent in advance of 2020, and I think that's really to be expected based on things like procurement timelines for replacing equipment. Certainly when that money was distributed in 2018, there was a general election around the corner, and so that limited what the resources could be used for in advance of the election. But so now I think that we've seen this menu of options, whether that's people upgrading their statewide voter registration databases, hardening those systems with multi-factor authentication. The ranking member, Mr. Davis, his state has implemented the cyber navigators that he mentioned. I think this is a great example of a state usage of money. And so what we're hearing from state and locals is that $380 million was greatly appreciated, but it's an investment. They're having to choose from that menu rather than getting to do all of those things which they would like to do to help secure our elections.
Thank you. And in terms of, I mean, does it kind of balance out then? I mean, do you have a sense sometimes that, or what you're seeing, that the needs are so much greater than this, really? Even though you're talking about up to 85%, is that, it sounds like I'm trying to figure out how you even run an agency with 22 employees so that you have the people who are able to facilitate this distribution. How do you do that?
Well, I would say that's absolutely, it's a separate issue, but one that I welcome hearing about. Yes, the reality, it was mentioned that our budget for this year was $9.2 million. Actually, 1.25 of that passes through to NIST, so we're at $7.95 million. Again, we have 22 employees. We are a federal agency with one legal counsel for our agency, with one financial person for our agency. I was very heartened in the opening statements to hear the chairperson talk about the fact that this committee was no longer considering the termination of our agency, and I welcome this moment where we can move beyond whether or not to keep the EAC and move into a phase
Can I ask
how
you,
we get better.
where do you think that capacity to act is most felt? Where are the needs the greatest right now?
Well, I think part of it is, number one, we need depth. We need to have more than one council, frankly, but also the impact of that decreased funding results in programming. And so when you've got election officials, particularly at the local level, are tasked with an extremely difficult job, and what we really do is help spread the best practices, help them learn from their colleagues. Things like our clearinghouse function and the clearies that we give out really embrace federalism, to the ranking member's point earlier, and share these best practices across states. And we aren't able to do that as effectively because of our limited resources.
And I'd say under the law, under HAVA, that was your mission.
Absolutely.
To make sure that you could relay those practices and that people could have a way of understanding where, in fact, they might be lagging behind even in terms of reaching out to their electorate in the areas. So, all right, thank you very much. What would you like us to do?
Give us more resources, plain and simple. I think that's the number one goal for the country in terms of ensuring that wherever I've gone, people have said, thank you for the down payment of the 380, but we need additional resources for the election for 2020, 2022, 2024, and beyond. I think that they want us to do more in terms of our IT training, to work more with DHS. I think that there's a ton of other things that I'm happy to talk with your staff for the next hour and a half on things that we can use and need.
Okay. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Let me just start with some very basics. The four of you are appointed for four-year terms, is that correct? And confirmed by the Senate. And you employ the executive director for a four-year term. Well, let me address it to you, Ms. McCormick. Is that correct? You employ, the four of you, acting in collaboration with each other, employ the executive director?
Yes, we take
Yeah.
recommendations from our boards.
Sure.
And go through the interview process, and then,
And your terms expire in November, and your executive director's term expires in November, is that right?
my term has been expired for many years.
You're holding over.
I'm on a holdover.
You're holding over right now. Is it correct to say that there is some controversy surrounding your executive director, Mr. Newby, Brian Newby? Would that be a fair statement?
I don't think that's a fair statement. I
You have
think
not
that
heard
that's
any?
been created. I think that Mr. Newby's doing a fine job.
Are you aware of
And I
a-
think the commission has done an amazing amount of work with the limited resources that it has.
I
It's
understand.
unfortunate that there are some people who are attacking him, but
Even in your agency, there are some people who are very
there are
dissatisfied.
some employees who are unhappy, but
Yes.
they've left the agency, yes.
From what I can understand, in 2017, there was a 16% drop in support for senior leadership. Is that an accurate survey? 16% drop in 2017 for support for senior leaders, and 23% drop in satisfaction regarding your policies and practices, and a 27% drop in another category. You're not aware of this survey?
I haven't read that survey myself. I know that there is an employee satisfaction survey that goes out throughout the federal government, and quite frankly, those are not that bad compared to some other agencies across the federal
When you
government.
get back to the office, if you find this to be incorrect, I would need to know it, because I don't need to repeat it if it's not correct. So are you telling me that you personally are satisfied with the performance of Brian Newby?
I am very confident in his abilities, and he's doing a fine job for the agency.
And do you anticipate that he will be retained as executive director?
I hope so.
Legally, is that possible?
I hope so.
And it would be a vote of three of you in order to make that happen?
I hope that's the case.
And if you had the will to do it or the desire to do it, would you be legally capable of terminating his position with the agency if you had just cause for doing so?
If we had just cause, whenever you have just cause, there's
So you cannot
reason to
assure us
terminate an
that
employee.
there will be a change in leadership in November at the executive director level?
I don't know what's going to happen.
Will
We're
it
going to
be-
follow the process that HAVA sets out, and I'm hoping that we can work in a bipartisan manner to keep the continuity of our leadership through the
But it will require
presidential
three
election.
votes to retain this leadership. Is that right?
Yes, it does.
Yeah. Are you saying that you feel that you do not have the statutory authority to begin a search for a new leader if the commissioners decide not to continue his leadership? You don't have the statutory authority to do that?
We have the statutory authority to do that once there's a vacancy in that position, yes.
And you don't believe that you can anticipate a vacancy?
That's correct. We don't have a vacancy. In the way HAVA is written, it says that an executive search committee shall be set up in the boards once there's a vacancy.
All right. Mr. Hicks, do you have unconditional confidence in Brian Newby as executive director?
I think there's been some growing pains. I think there's some good things that he has done. I think that there are some bad things that he's done. But I think that that's something that the commission should look at, whether or not we want to retain him and move forward, or whether or not we want to open this up for new additional folks to apply for the job. We have two new commissioners who are here now who didn't have the opportunity to vote on that, but I think opening it up to whoever wants to apply for the job now, as the chair and ranking member said earlier, that this was a different time, that people were looking to get rid of the agency, and so I think that there might be more.
Are you aware of the employee survey in 2017 that I made reference to?
I'm aware of it. I have not read it.
It appears to me that there is low morale in the agency, that so many of your employees have lost confidence in your leadership, and I would ask that you look very plainly at what that suggests. Mr. Palmer, I will conclude with you. Are you totally satisfied with your executive director, or do you think there's room for improvement?
I do have confidence in Executive Director Newby. When I am new to the agency, but I've also worked with the agency, and many election officials at the local and state level admire his leadership in the community and at the AC.
But my question is there room for improvement?
Well, there's always room for improvement.
Yeah.
But what I would say is that the EAC, going back 5 to 10 years, had a number of IG complaints of discrimination, retaliation at the executive level. We have not had 2 to 3 years that I've seen of IG reports under Mr. Newby's leadership. There hasn't been any complaints that have been brought to the level of the IG, which is, a fairly invasive investigatory. So the IG has not had any complaints when it comes to retaliation or issues regarding management.
During the Nixon years, there was a suggestion that there was a cancer growing on the presidency. I feel that there's a cancer growing on this commission. I yield back.
Gentlelady from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you all so much for being here. Certainly we want for every federal agency, including yours, to be above reproach and people not be concerned about who runs it. Let me just ask this question, Madam Chair. If you had an employee who, in his recent history, at an executive level, had misused and mismanaged public funds, who had abused his authority, who had engaged in an inappropriate relationship with a subordinate, who displayed lewd behavior in the workplace, what would you do with that employee?
There's a due process provisions in the federal government, and so we have had those situations at the EAC in the past. We had an employee who misused federal funds and violated the law, and then we were told that there was a due process that we had to follow.
And what happened to that employee?
That employee was retained, actually, and eventually retired from the agency.
Okay. But do you not have such an employee now?
I'm not aware of an employee who's behaving that way, no.
Well, let me make sure that I send it to you, because those are the accusations actually against Mr. Newby from his former employee just a few months after you hired him. So I will make sure you have that information. I think it's important to be upfront about what we are dealing with. And the one thing that I can not say enough is that when we are using taxpayers' dollars, we need to have the higher standards. And I clearly don't think that that is the case here. Mr. Hicks, can you give me any information as to what you have learned from the EAC state funding plans that have been received, or the chair, either one?
Well, thank you for the question. I think that some of the things that we've learned from the state funding plans in terms of the $380 million that went out is that states need additional funds, that they are looking to purchase partial voting equipment because they don't have enough money to fully fund for voting equipment overall. I think 95% of the money is going towards 3 different things, either voting equipment, voter registration, or cybersecurity upgrades. But I think that overall, what we've learned is that they basically need additional funding.
How much funding do you think they need?
I knew that was coming. As elections happen every 2 years, I think that it depends, because what is needed in Maine, it might not be what's needed in Ohio.
Right, but just in light of the troubles that we have had over the last few elections, Mr. Davis is right, it didn't start in 2016, but it is getting worse. It is not getting better. So even though this is not the first occurrence of interference by Russia, and maybe they're now saying possibly China and others, what is the most pressing need for states right now in terms of the security of their equipment? And maybe I need to go down to Mr. Palmer.
Well, with regard to the most pressing need for security, you might think the answer would be voting systems, but I actually believe that voter registration systems at the state and local level are the most pressing need for upgrade. And so I'll just leave it at that. I think that is the most our most vulnerable aspect of what cyber intrusions are, and so I believe those two areas would be the most pressing need.
Okay, I'm going to close, Madam Chair, but I would just say this. When there is no confidence in the leadership of a department, you get reports like you just saw with morale low, people not believing in their leadership. Those are the things that happen. I would suggest very, very strongly that I will make sure that you get it, that you read it, and then still decide if that's the proper leadership for this organization. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Gentlelady yields back, and the gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you very much. Question to start with is for Ms. McCormick. Have you worked with the Department of Homeland Security to understand and respond to threats after foreign interference in the 2016 election?
We have been working with the Department of Homeland Security since before the 2016 presidential election, and providing information to the state and local election officials on escalating threats over the years, yes.
What, if we could unpack that a little bit more, what initiatives or guidelines does the EAC specifically have to address election network hacking or voter data manipulation?
We have a multifaceted approach to providing the states the resources that they need. We provide trainings, we provide checklists, resources, white papers. We're available at any time to discuss issues with the states and locals with regard to their election security. We've partnered with DHS and other agencies on products that the states and locals can use to secure their infrastructure.
Obviously, this is going to be a big topic of discussion going into the 2020 election as well as future elections. What initiatives would you like to see the EAC take to ensure our voting systems are strong and secure?
Well, if we had the resources, I think we would like to see some cyber assistance units out amongst the states that we can have available to the state and local election officials to call on to help them with securing and mitigating any risks that are out there.
Anything in the hopper to deal specifically with foreign interference when it comes to false information or misrepresentation?
Well, social media is not in our bailiwick, actually. That is not part of our mission. I think that there are some ideas out there that we can discuss, perhaps providing a toolkit to state and local election officials to provide to campaigns when they register to become, candidates on the issues and what they can do to secure their systems as well.
Sure. And if I could get just a quick yes or no coming across the panel, starting left to right with Honorable Don Palmer. Do you agree that states need to play a significant role in funding their election equipment?
Yes, I do believe there should be a partnership.
Okay. Ms. McCormick?
Yes, I do.
Sir?
Yes.
Okay. Mr.
Yes, I believe that
same as well?
5% match showed that.
Okay, thank you. Regarding the 2018 appropriation to date, how much of that money has been distributed to the states and how much of that has been spent by the states? Does anybody want to take a stab at it, or anybody on knowledge base? Don't want to put anybody on the spot unless you've had a chance to.
Well, 100% has been distributed out to the states.
Okay, 100%.
Right, we got that money out last year.
Okay, and that money is being spent on this arena that we're talking?
Cybersecurity issues, purchasing new voting equipment, and voter registration are the three main ones that I believe states have done that, but they're also going into other aspects of it as well.
I'm out of questions, but I'm going to come up with a few more because I just want to hear that baritone voice by Mr. Thomas Hicks speak a little bit longer there. So that's Lou Rawls, eat your heart out right there. Okay, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I'm wondering, for each commissioner, do you think there would be value for the EAC to add a division that's simply dedicated to technological election security? Let's start with you, Mr. Palmer.
I think that's an idea that we could look at. I think that we have a pretty robust testing and certification program and an IT division, and I probably would think that we would fold it into that department if we did something like that.
Well, I guess that goes to my next question. I know you can't always believe what you read in the paper, but I did see a political article recently discussing the departure of Mr. Ryan Messias, and the article said that, well, actually the title of it is EAC Losing Key Expert Reflects Crisis at Commission. And the article discussed Director Newby's leadership as part of a generally poor leadership, quote, and that, quote, they drained so much technical expertise when Mr. Macias left. I understand that shortly thereafter you announced, Madam Chairwoman, that an individual, Jerome Lovato, had been appointed as the new testing and certification director. Can you describe the process by which Mr. Lovato was hired? Was it an open call for applications? Did he apply? How many other people applied?
The commissioners don't involve themselves in personnel matters.
So how did he get the appointment?
That is a decision of the executive director, and yes, the job was posted. They received many applications. I believe Mr. Macias was one of the applicants as well. Obviously, he did not get the job, and Mr. Lovato did get the job.
Okay, so it's my understanding, and correct me if I'm incorrect, that this certification and testing program has absorbed several new responsibilities. I'm wondering, will Mr. Lovato be conducting his work from his residence in Colorado, or is he moving here?
He's already an employee of the EAC, and he is going to be moving back and forth between Colorado and the EAC's headquarters in Silver Spring. He will be located next to one of our testing labs, very close to one of our testing labs.
In Colorado?
Yes, ma'am.
Is there a SCIF there?
I believe there's a SCIF that is available to him, yes.
I'd love to know that if you're not positive on this.
Well, he would probably use whatever the state of Colorado uses. He used to
Well, that's
work
not
at
good enough. We need to meet our standards.
Well, we don't have a SCIF at our headquarters either.
Really? That's disturbing.
In fact, Madam Chairperson, we just recently were given clearances, interim clearances, a couple of weeks ago, actually, not long ago. So we've been without, and it's at the secret level as opposed to the top secret level. So we have not had clearances for the 2.5+ years that we've been asking for them, and we have finally been able to get those interim clearances, and hopefully they'll become permanent clearances. But it is an issue, and that we are working on it with DHS.
I'm advised, and I don't know that this, you'll correct me if I've been advised incorrectly, that one of the individuals that's been hired to serve as in certification currently serves as a director of certification at Dominion, which is a very large vendor of voting machines, and that after the announcement of this individual's hire, she actually was still meeting representing Dominion and will start at the EAC in the same month as leaving her post in Dominion. I'm wondering, usually if we leave the Congress, there's a cooling off period for a year. Is there concern about a cooling off period, the appearance of a conflict of interest in this hire? What were those considerations in the mind of the agency when this person was hired, and what steps will you take to make sure that people don't favor one company or another because of their prior employment?
Sure, Madam Chairwoman. There is ethics officer and the general counsel, and as employees either come to the EAC or leave the EAC, they're briefed on their ethical requirements on taking a position at the EAC in testing and certification. And so the employee that you're speaking about, although we didn't hire her, she is a certification director for one of the vendors. So she's worked with certification in the states and at the federal level, and it brings a lot of assets to the Election Assistance Commission.
Well, I don't even know this person. I'm not
Yes.
attacking her qualifications in
Yes.
any way. I'm just, the point I'm trying to make is if you've got somebody who's representing a company at the same time, and then they're moving over to the agency that's regulating that company, it causes people to question, the dispassionate nature of
Right,
the
so there is an
agency.
ethics office, and the individual won't be working with that vendor's testing program.
But that's not the point. I mean, if she's testing I think I've made my point, and I can see that my time has also expired, and other members have been very good about staying within their 5 minutes, so I will stop now and thank the commissioners for being here, and note that we have the record will be open for 5 days. If members have additional questions, they could submit them for the record, and we'd ask the commission, if that should occur, to answer them promptly. We do thank you for being here, and unless there are further matters before this committee, we're adjourned with thanks to each of you.